And from the responses that we had to the questionnaires that we administered to the industry, some of the perspectives that I'll be sharing in this presentation came from that. By way of background, without belaboring the issues, the kind of contract that we are talking about, of course, the fundamental principle is that all parties are free to enter into contracts. Commercial contracts are supposed to be entered on the basis of equality and freedom of contract, where that is possible. But of course, for the industry, there is important to recognize two categories. The first are the regulated agreements, and the others are the non-regulated agreements. The one that we are focusing more on are the regulated agreements. And these are agreements that are regulated because of the importance they have, either to issues of interconnection and interoperability of networks, either because of commercial purposes, or for, most importantly, for competition also. Because we need to have, we have a telecoms network, because we have interoperable and interconnected networks. So essentially, in that regard, we are talking about contracts like the interconnect agreements. The NCC is allowed to regulate these contracts. The parties' freedom of contract is, generally, in some ways, for lack of a better word, is curtailed in some ways because of the policy and other regulatory reasons that I mentioned earlier. So we are looking at interconnect agreements, we are looking at co-location and infrastructure sharing, and then of course, we're also looking at some of these management services agreements. It's not just the NCC that regulates some of these agreements. NOTAB, the CBN will also have a say into some of these agreements. And then of course the other types are the non-regulated agreements. Those are not going to be part of this discussion, because those are not the ones that NCC is in any way responsible for. So interconnect and facility agreements are actually the most contentious in terms of the outcome, looking at the debt situation for the industry. A brief, these figures are as at 2020. So you can see, we didn't do a graphical representation because we would have loved to have figures for 2021, but this is as at 2020. I can't, okay, so you can see how the debts have grown. There was a spike sort of in 2016, between 2017 and 2018, you had it growing to by about 243%. And it's important to note that these are actually only just debts that were reported to the NCC. These are based on the NCC's records. We are not talking about high-cost areas with low-cost areas. The telecoms industry cannot really do that because we all have a national tariff structure, so we can't be as flexible as we would love to be. Then also issues of regulatory approvals before, of course, the agreements are regulated for a reason. It's to protect consumers so that you don't just disconnect services without taking care of the interests of the subscribers. However, we find that in a lot of cases, people actually take undue advantage of this. Then, of course, the first factor, I've spoken to that earlier, the fact that we have much thinner margins, which may be why it may be difficult to attract commercial funding, as we had earlier. Now, of course, the most prominent of these debts are the interconnect and the facility debts. And I think it's important to look at we all know what interconnection is, but the second point is actually the most important. I would always hear Mr. Akoloye would always say that interconnect payments are actually supposed to be first-line charges. First-line charges in the sense that everybody can actually project based on your subscriber numbers. We can project what your interconnect payment should be. So ideally, in an ideal world, it shouldn't be a problem paying, because subscribers have actually prepaid for interconnection. But that is not always the case. As we saw earlier, we are talking about 182 billion naira by 2020. And again, looking at, referring back to the discussions we had earlier, I'm wondering whether one of the reasons why operators don't really, or our licensees don't like going to the banks, apart from the obvious fact that it doesn't seem as if the banks really understand the fundamentals of this industry, maybe because if we can finance ourselves by up to 182 billion, why do we need to go to the banks? So maybe that is one of the reasons why the debt situation in our industry is so high. For interconnect specific, yes, of course, there are sometimes interconnect disputes amongst players, and sometimes, yes, those disputes are protracted in terms of the resolution, talking about reconciling the books and all that. But essentially, it's something to worry about, because we all have agreements which specify the time limits for these disputes to be resolved. Again, poor financial practice, and these are not just coming from the NCC, like I said earlier. This is coming from the industry, from the survey that we carried out. A lot of people believe that if we improve our financial accounting practices, using the prudence principle and all that, we could actually improve the case of debt. And then, of course, some actually, as we mentioned earlier, it's not as if one is saying that debt is not a legitimate source of business financing. Yes, it is, but you find that it's possible, and the study, I guess, would also reveal that it's possible that some players may actually be detaining interconnect and facility debts as a deliberate strategy, or anti-competition strategy. So we are looking at the possibility of that being the case as well. And then, of course, naturally everybody would ask, NCC is the regulator, if you consider this to be such a big problem, what have you done about it? And here are some of the things that the NCC has done. The licensing of interconnect clearing houses, some of them are in the room, was meant to moderate the issue. All the things that we identified as causing long delays, to try and remove that, to try and make reconciliations faster, to try and make payments faster. It's debatable whether the clearing houses have been able to perform that function as efficiently as was envisaged when they were licensed. Then, of course, when the NCC noticed that the long delays in granting disconnection approvals was being abused, NCC introduced the disconnection guidelines. That was also meant to streamline the processes, make it faster, make it more efficient. I understand that the guidelines are under review again as we speak, so essentially trying to make it even more efficient as it is. NCC has not been, NCC has been careful as it would be expected in terms of granting approvals, because like I said, it's meant to protect the consumers, but it's something that the NCC has done in deserving cases. There has also been dispute resolution. NCC has been more or less, in some ways, turned into like a debt collector. If you look through the Act, you won't find anywhere there where it says that NCC's responsibility is to facilitate debt collection. But in the guise of resolving disputes, we found ourselves being turned into debt collecting agents in a lot of cases. The last one that we're actually looking at, which I mentioned earlier, and it's something that the recent you actually asked me to stress about, is the possibility of actually introducing a clearing system, an automated clearing system, which all interested parties can actually subscribe to, and which can actually allow us, if properly implemented, to actually eliminate the debts completely, if that were possible. But it's something that we are also looking at. In terms of impact, I'm sure we don't need to stress this too much. This situation is actually seriously impacting the industry in terms of quality of service, because when you restrain funds from their legitimate use, it impacts the creditors' capacity to improve on services. Also, in terms of growth of the sector, somebody, as I was coming up, somebody mentioned to me that he hopes the banks are not in the room, because then if you hear that we have such a serious problem, it may be a disincentive for them putting money into our sector. We find that that is actually happening as it were. And then, of course, the regulatory cost. It costs money for the NCC to put parties in a room, to put staff on the road to mediate this, to go look into systems, to go reconcile books and so on. Those are not really the core functions of the NCC, but it's something that we have to do because of the impact of these debts on industry overall sustainability. So the final part of this presentation, of course, is the suggested solutions. Again, I think I need to also stress that these are also solutions. Some of them are actually coming from the discussions that we are having with operators in the course of introducing or implementing the automated system. So the presentation says that, or highlights that we can actually look at this from two different perspectives. Since we have narrowed down the problem to two basic areas. First is business practices, and second are regulatory factors that can actually assist the industry. So in terms of the industry factors, the first thing is to improve on our governance practices. The NCC is working on the corporate, as well, the corporate governance guidelines for the sector. Is meant to be something that is in progress and will soon be released. There is the possibility that we would need to actually, introduce more, more stringent measures in terms of helping people, to be more sensitive to their obligations to their interconnect and other partners, not just interconnect, but also facilities and other partners. Then for operators to, everybody, it's the whole ecosystem thing. So we need to also firm up our credit policies, such that if we are giving interconnect on credit, like other things that we give out on credit, it's important that we firm up policies around that. It's also important that boards, typically interconnect is an operational thing. Facility debt is an operational thing that many boards do not pay as close enough attention. That's what experience has shown. So it's important that boards take more personal responsibility or corporate responsibility for these things because of the impact that they're having on the industry. And then management of the agreements. It's actually about compliance management, managing the compliance process from the point the contracts are signed to when the obligations are undertaken and to when they are satisfied. It's important that there are warning triggers. I'm sure NCC does not need to say this to operators. It's something that we all do in our normal day-to-day operations, but it's something that we need to improve in terms of the impact that this debt situation is having. Then the other side of the solutions, the ones that were suggested, is in terms of the regulatory interventions. I've mentioned about the corporate governance guidelines, and then the NCC is looking at actually stipulating minimum share capital and debt ratios, the same way you have in the banks. It needs to be said that when we go into things like this, for some, for those we might call the industry purists, these are like, it's something that should actually be a self-regulation thing. It's not something that the regulator of telecoms, infrastructure and services should actually be going into. So maybe the industry needs to think about how we self-regulate, how we can improve self-regulation. But in the absence of that, this is what the NCC is looking at in terms of minimum share capital and other ratios. Then denial of regulatory assistance is I think it's one of the rarest sanctions that the NCC would impose in very, very deserving circumstances. It's hardly, in my experience, I don't think it's been done more than 3 or 4 times since this industry was set up. But it's something that we've been asked to look into in terms of addressing this question of interconnect debt. So if you are, and I keep saying interconnect, but not just interconnect, but interconnect and other depth. So if you are in such a position that we cannot trust you your obligations that you freely entered into, then why should the regulator be spending time and effort, that can be used on other more productive things, trying to help you fulfill what should be normal obligations? So that too is on the table. Then in terms of, as a corollary to that, is also individuals who we find are consistently involved in these things. The industry, the NCC is being asked to maybe blacklist some of these people. Make sure that if you have not been, if you cannot trust from dragging the industry down on that part. So it's another thing that is being considered. Another suggested solution is to make renewal of regulatory resources, licenses and so on, to make it subject to good financial standing with your other operators in the ecosystem. That also is on the table. Also on the table is to maybe permit prepaid interconnection. Again, the automated system is along these lines, so it's the possibility that you would have to prepay for interconnection, and so your customers would impact on your services. It's not an ideal situation, but it's something that is on the table as a proposed suggestion. Then bank guarantees, we've always had bank guarantees being used, but for the reasons we discussed earlier this morning, it doesn't seem as if that is as efficient as it should be. So it's something that we feel, another collateral, somebody mentioned insurance bonds and so on earlier in the day, and it's something that would need to be also considered. Then, faster, I did say that the interconnect disconnection, or rather the disconnection guidelines are being reviewed, so hopefully we can actually make it more liberal. So maybe that will serve as a disincentive to keeping the debts for as long as they currently are. And then of course the final one, which is the automated settlement system. The idea is that if we have that in place, it's like an enhanced interconnect clearinghouse system, but the governance around it, the format and everything is still under consideration. To conclude, like I said, the discussions earlier this morning, and then of course some of the things we've tried to highlight here now, illustrate how serious this problem is. And it's not something, it's something that we don't believe that is a strictly business solution or a strictly regulatory solution. It's something that we feel that it's both sides, both commercial and regulatory. But whichever path we choose, whether we try to take industry self-regulation further, or whether we are forced to regulate harder, it's important that we act on it because it's something that has a very serious impact on the industry. Thank you very much for your time. That is Mr.